It takes a brush with death to realize that a parachute offered by someone else is more than just a way to survive. It can become a lifelong burden, a heavy shackle forged from guilt and sin. In my past life, she handed me that gear, and I was fool enough to mistake the gesture for love, but 6 years of marriage finally proved it was nothing but pure resentment. Now that I've been sent back to that cabin, she's trying the same old trick by offering me the parachute again. This time, I am stepping back and letting her follow her true instincts. I finally understand that survival does not depend on a piece of equipment. It depends entirely on the fact that her heart has always belonged to Noah. When the plane began its fatal descent, there was only one functional parachute left in the entire cabin. In that desperate moment between life and death, Jasmine reached out and handed that final chance of survival to me. I managed to survive the jump and hit the ground safely, but my half-brother, Noah, the son my father had through a scandalous affair, perished in the wreckage. After the rescue, Jasmine insisted on moving forward with our engagement, and we had a massive, glittering wedding. Throughout our 6 years of marriage, she nurtured a deep, silent grudge, convinced that I was responsible for Noah's death. I became her sworn enemy in her mind, and she made sure those 6 years were a living hell for me. On the very day we were supposed to finalize our divorce, she dragged me to the site where Noah had died, intending for us to end our lives together right there. However, when I opened my eyes again, I realized I had been transported back to the morning of the crash. I have made my decision this time, and I'm going to give the chance of survival to the man she actually loves. By the time I fully processed that I had traveled back in time, the cabin was already shuddering with violent turbulence. The flight attendants were rushing down the aisle handing out parachutes, but when they reached Noah and me, they realized one of the packs was defective. Jasmine hesitated for only a fraction of a second before thrusting the only functional parachute into my hands. "James, take this," she urged. I looked at the agonized expression on her face as she forced the straps into my grip, and I simply took a step back, shaking my head in a firm refusal. "No, give it to Noah first," I said. I refused to carry the weight of another person's death on my conscience this time, because I want to live for myself. The moment she heard my words, Jasmine let out a long, audible sigh of relief. She gave me a long look, and the tension finally drained from her face, her voice even sounding a bit cheerful. She moved with sudden speed, pulling Noah toward her and securing the last parachute onto his shoulders. "James, you are my fiancé, and I really should be putting you first," she said. "But since you are the one insisting that I save Noah, I will respect your wishes." As soon as the words left her mouth, she grabbed Noah and sprinted toward the emergency exit, leaping out right after him. Throughout the entire ordeal, she never even glanced back at me once. It was as if she feared that looking back for even a second would give me time to change my mind. She must have a very low opinion of me if she thinks everyone is as manipulative and indecisive as she is. In my previous life, she was the one who made the choice, yet she spent the rest of her life drowning in regret. Back then, she had been the one to press that final parachute into my hands. After I made the jump, she didn't follow me. Instead, she chose to stay behind in the cabin with me, leaving Noah all alone on a plane that was doomed to go down in flames. Although we reached the ground safely and called for help immediately, Noah's body was never recovered from the vast expanse of the wilderness. When the news of Noah's death was first confirmed, Jasmine didn't even show a hint of emotion in front of me. She simply remarked that he was an insignificant person who didn't really matter. She handled all his final arrangements with a chilling level of composure. While I was spiraling into depression and guilt, her only request was that we not leave him to be buried in some lonely, forgotten place. She suggested burying Noah in the Sterling family plot since there was an available space. I agreed without hesitation and even offered to postpone our wedding out of respect for the tragedy. She just squeezed my hand and looked at me with such fabricated warmth, telling me that marrying me was her greatest dream. She insisted that we couldn't possibly delay our special day for someone so unimportant, reminding me how long she had waited for that moment. Back then, I actually believed she loved me with all her heart and wanted to build a life together. I didn't realize until much later that her rush to the altar was entirely motivated by the man she had called insignificant. She married me to torture me, making sure I spent every single day atoning for Noah's death. The irony is that no one ever forced her to give me that parachute. It wasn't my command, and it wasn't a choice I made on her behalf. There was no reason for Noah's blood to be on my hands. This time around, I have handed the lifeline to the man she truly loves. If anything, she should be thanking me for this. As I watched them vanish through the cabin door without a single backward glance, I immediately turned my attention to my own survival. Knowing Jasmine, I couldn't count on her to actually call for a rescue team once she reached the ground safely. Across 2 lifetimes, it has always been clear that Jasmine's heart belongs to my half-brother, Noah. In my previous life, she called for search and rescue the second we had a signal, even though the chances of finding him were nearly zero. The situation has flipped now, and since Noah is the one who has the parachute, I have no reason to believe she will be in any rush to send help for me. I will be lucky if she doesn't just announce my death to the world the moment her feet touch the ground. It doesn't matter which timeline we are in, the only person she has ever truly loved is Noah. In my first life, I didn't find out until after the wedding that Jasmine and Noah were actually old acquaintances from college. They were both illegitimate children who had been sidelined by their prominent families. Their shared background created a bond of mutual understanding, and they had apparently sworn to stay together forever in secret. My engagement to her was nothing more than a strategic move because I am the legitimate heir to the Sterling fortune. I was the one destined to inherit the entire Sterling estate. Even though she loved Noah, she chose to save me in that first life simply to secure her grip on my family's wealth and social standing. In that past life, Jasmine ended up bitterly regretting her decision. She had only saved me because she was blinded by the sheer scale of the Sterling Empire. This time, I have made the choice for her, and she really ought to be grateful. Once they were completely out of sight, I turned around and sprinted toward the cockpit. In my last life, Jasmine slowly brainwashed me into believing the crash was my fault. I spent years feeling guilty, thinking Noah died only because I had stolen his one chance at survival. That guilt drove me to go to flight school and earn my pilot's license. I obsessed over the flight data from the crash, watching simulations hundreds of times and consulting with the best experts in the field. Every time I presented the reconstructed flight data to senior pilots, their analysis of what happened was more shocking than the last. I spent so many nights praying for a second chance to go back and fix things. Now that my wish has actually come true, the adrenaline is surging through my veins. Using everything I learned in my previous life, I threw myself into the pilot's seat, buckled the harness, and gripped the controls. I began making small adjustments to the aircraft's attitude, fighting to stabilize our rate of descent. At the end of the day, this entire disaster was triggered by a high-stakes business deal in Chicago. The Sterling family and another rival firm were both fighting over a massive contract. The truth is that there was nothing mechanically wrong with this plane. The crew had simply been bought off by our competitors. This whole accident was a stage performance. They sabotaged one of the parachutes specifically to sow discord among the key members of our families. The plan was to create enough chaos within the Sterling family so they could swoop in and steal the Chicago deal. I'm not going to let history repeat itself now that I have a second chance. I sat in that cockpit, opened the throttle, and worked the control column and rudders with practiced ease. The engines roared back to life, and the plane began to pull out of its steep dive. I felt the airframe stabilize as the nose slowly began to point back toward the horizon. Thanks to my careful adjustments, the descent was finally under control. Unfortunately, the initial dive had cost us too much altitude to make it to a proper runway. Even with a full crew, there was no way to make it back to the airport, so a forced landing was my only option. I was lucky that we weren't over a major city. Instead, we were over the vast wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains. I kept my eyes glued to the instruments and the terrain below, managing our glide path as carefully as I could. The wings clipped the tops of the trees, shearing through branches as we descended. The plane finally skidded to a halt in a secluded valley between two ridges. When I climbed out of the cockpit and felt the solid earth beneath my boots, I truly felt like I had been given a second life. The crash site was incredibly remote, with nothing but wilderness as far as the eye could see. I checked my phone, but there wasn't even a hint of signal out here. I tried calling 911 several times, but the calls wouldn't go through. I realized I couldn't wait for help and had to start moving, so I gathered whatever supplies were left in the cabin. I packed a small bag and started trekking down toward the base of the mountain. The terrain was brutal, and within minutes, my jeans were torn by the thick brush and thorns. My ankles were bleeding from the sharp grass, but I didn't have anything to clean the wounds with, so I just kept going. After what felt like hours, I spotted a figure on a trail further down the mountain. Relief washed over me, and I started shouting for help. The person stopped and turned around to see who was calling. The moment she turned, I froze where I stood, recognizing her immediately as Ava Harrison. When Ava realized it was me, she looked confused at first, but then she hurried toward me. I saw a flicker of genuine concern in her eyes as she took in my bloodied clothes and various scrapes. She quickly composed herself, hiding her worry behind a mask of professional calm. "James, what on earth happened to you? And why are you out here by yourself?" she asked. I gave her a quick summary of the crash while she listened intently. She let out a long breath and told me that surviving something like that was a miracle, then offered to clean up my wounds. I expected her to just lead the way, but she actually stepped up and let me lean on her for support. She slowly helped me navigate the rest of the path toward her SUV parked at the trailhead. I put my arm around her shoulders for balance, and I could immediately smell the faint, elegant scent of roses lingering on her skin. Feeling a bit self-conscious, I suggested that I could probably walk on my own if she just led the way. Ava didn't listen and instead pulled me closer, insisting that the terrain was too rough for me to handle alone. Her mind was made up, so I didn't argue and let her help me all the way to the vehicle. She opened the passenger door and made sure I was settled comfortably before heading to the driver's side. She grabbed a first aid kit from the back and began cleaning my cuts with antiseptic and gauze. She asked if it hurt, but I just told her I was fine. Watching her focused and slightly worried expression made me feel overwhelmed. I had to squeeze my own arm to keep from tearing up. My mind involuntarily flashed back to a very different scene from my past life. It was shortly after my wedding to the Ava from my first life, at a corporate gala where everyone was pressuring her to drink. I was worried about her, so I leaned in and quietly suggested she slow down. She snapped instantly and shoved me into the champagne tower right in front of all the guests. The entire structure came crashing down, and I landed face first into a sea of shattered glass and spilled alcohol. Shards of glass sliced into my skin, and my blood began to mix with the sticky champagne on the floor. The pain was so sharp and sudden that I couldn't help but cry out in front of everyone. I was struggling to stand as the waitstaff rushed over to help me. When I looked up at her, hoping for some shred of concern, I found nothing but cold, heartless indifference. "Does it hurt?" "Good, it should," she said, her voice sounding like ice. She told me that Noah's death was far more painful than anything I was feeling, and that his body had been unrecognizable in the wreckage. She blamed me for everything, screaming that Noah would still be alive if I hadn't taken a parachute for myself. I stood there bleeding in front of the entire elite social circle, letting her humiliate me as if I were nothing more than dirt under her shoe. That was the moment I realized Ava and Noah had been in love long before our marriage. She had only married me to get her hands on the Sterling family's influence and bank accounts. I started laughing right there, though my eyes were stinging with bitter tears at the sheer absurdity of it all. I asked her if she honestly believed that the crash and everything that followed was my fault. I pointed out that the plane had been sabotaged by her own business rivals and that they were the ones who ruined the parachute. I asked her if she was insane for blaming me while refusing to say a single word to the people who actually caused the tragedy. I walked away and went to the hospital by myself to get my wounds stitched up. Our relationship never recovered, and she spent the next several years publicly mocking and belittling me every chance she got. But here, in this life, the woman in front of me was treating my injuries with incredible gentleness. Her touch was so light that I could barely feel her fingers against my skin. I took a deep breath to steady my voice and thanked her. She looked up suddenly and caught my wrist, her gaze meeting mine with an unexpected intensity. "James, I think you and Jasmine were never a good match," she said quietly. "But that doesn't mean the alliance between the Sterling and Harrison families has to come to an end." I stared at her, wondering if I had misheard what she just implied. Before I could ask her to clarify, she let go of my wrist and turned away. She handed me a pain reliever and told me not to worry about anything else right now. She offered to drive me home, and I simply nodded and agreed. I said yes, but the truth was that I had no desire to go back to that empty house. My parents' marriage was just a business arrangement where they both got what they wanted, and I was merely the byproduct of their contract. Once I was born, they both wasted no time finding their own lovers on the side. I was just a lingering reminder of a marriage that was never meant to be anything more than a transaction. They both agreed that I would inherit the family estate eventually, but neither of them was willing to offer me even an ounce of genuine affection. As for Jasmine, she never treated me like a real husband and refused to let me accompany her to public events. She wouldn't even let me come near her in private. Whenever anyone asked about our marriage, she would just sneer or make a cutting remark about my incompetence. Once our companies merged, she worked with her team to systematically strip me of my shares and influence. I let it happen because I thought I loved her, but I ended up being pushed into a corner with nothing left. Looking at Ava now, as she carefully finished bandaging my wounds, I decided to take a chance. I told her I didn't want to go home and asked if I could stay at her place for a while. When she didn't answer right away, I tried to look as vulnerable and exhausted as I felt. I leaned into the role of the helpless survivor, hoping she would take pity on me. In my previous life, we had barely spoken because she was already preparing to move to London at this point. Yet when she heard about my divorce in the old timeline, she caught the first flight back just to support me without asking for anything in return. She has always been the one person who shows up when my life is falling apart. She looked at me for a long moment, and the expression in her eyes suddenly shifted to something much more intense. She asked me if I was sure, warning me that staying with her would come with a price. She leaned in close, and I instinctively pulled back slightly, but the overwhelming scent of roses was making my head spin. I told her I was willing to pay whatever price she asked. She asked me if I was serious, and I looked her in the eye and told her I had never been more certain. She let out a small, mysterious smile that made the air between us feel heavy with tension. For a second, I thought she was going to kiss me, but she just laughed and reached out to ruffle my messy hair. She told me to remember that promise and then started the car. We stopped at a gas station on the way back to get some supplies. Ava was holding my hand as we walked toward the convenience store to grab some snacks, but we ran right into Jasmine and a search party. Jasmine looked like she had seen a ghost when she spotted me. Her eyes widened in total shock before she rushed forward, acting as though she was overjoyed to see me alive. I gave her a cold, indifferent look and tightened my grip on Ava's hand. I asked her what she expected to happen, and she just stood there, speechless and confused. She clearly hadn't expected me to survive a fall from that altitude and be standing there looking at her. Noah, who was standing right behind her, immediately locked his eyes on Ava. He pushed past Jasmine and stood in our way, asking if Ava was the one who had found me. He kept looking between the two of us with a suspicious glare. He wanted to know how I was still alive and why Ava just happened to be in the middle of nowhere to find me. He basically accused us of having some kind of secret relationship behind their backs. I couldn't believe he was implying that I'd stage a plane crash just to see Ava. He reminded me that Ava and Jasmine were currently locked in a bitter battle over the Harrison family inheritance. He sneered at the fact that we walked out of the woods together, calling it a far too convenient coincidence. He demanded that I stop lying and admit that we were working together. I took a long breath and looked at him, feeling my patience wear thin. In my last life, I'd spent years carrying the crushing weight of guilt over his death, even though we never found him. Because we were close in age, I had always tried to be the bigger person and treat him like family. It was now painfully clear that he had never reciprocated that feeling and saw me only as an obstacle. Noah opened his mouth to keep insulting me, and I finally hit my breaking point. I stepped forward and planted a solid punch right in the middle of his arrogant face. The sound of the impact echoed in the quiet gas station parking lot. Noah stumbled back in total shock, and even Jasmine was too stunned to make sound. I took a moment to look at my knuckles, feeling a strange sense of peace now that he was finally silent. The quiet was actually quite refreshing after years of his constant whining. I spotted a patrol car pulling in and waved the officer over before anyone could react. I told the cop I wanted to file a report for defamation, and we were all taken down to the station to sort out. Noah tried to tell the cops that Ava and I had orchestrated the crash as part of some elaborate scheme. I countered by filing a formal complaint against him for malicious slander. We spent several hours giving statements and waiting for the investigators to finish their initial review. Noah didn't stop staring at me with a hateful expression, clearly looking for any weakness he could exploit. He leaned over and asked me how I could be so heartless to my own family and my fiancée. I didn't even bother looking at him, focusing instead on the bandages Ava had meticulously wrapped around my feet. I waited for a long moment before asking him if he had a single shred of evidence to back up his claims. I reminded him that making false accusations carried serious legal consequences. I asked him if he had already forgotten what happened to the last person who tried to ruin my reputation. Back in high school, a kid got jealous of my ranking and started a rumor that I was a cheater. The rumor spread like wildfire, but my parents weren't the type to let things slide and involve the police immediately. Every single student involved in the smear campaign was hauled down to the precinct. Some tried to claim they were just following the crowd, but the detectives broke them down one by one. By the end of the night, everyone had signed full confessions and were facing expulsion and legal charges. Noah's face went pale as he realized I wasn't bluffing, and he finally shut his mouth. Jasmine, however, couldn't help but jump in to defend him. She stepped in front of him and looked at me with pure disgust, telling me to stop threatening her brother. She claimed he was just sharing his honest opinion and that I was overreacting by involving the law. I gave her a long, cold stare and asked her how she could be so sure about what happened back then. I suggested that maybe she was so defensive because she was the one who had orchestrated the whole high school scandal. Jasmine looked like she had been slapped, but she quickly regained her composure thanks to her years of experience in corporate politics. She narrowed her eyes and reminded me that accusations required proof. I laughed at the irony of her suddenly caring about the burden of proof. I just said her name with a tone of pure mockery, and she turned a ghostly shade of white while shaking with rage. Her voice hit a high, shrill pitch as she started to scream at me, but she was interrupted by Ava walking out of the detective's office. Ava took one look at the scene and immediately stepped between me and Jasmine. She stood her ground with an air of absolute authority and asked them if they were actually planning on getting physical. I leaned back and watched Jasmine fall apart under Ava's gaze. Jasmine was fuming and kept insisting to anyone who would listen that she was the one engaged to me. Ava turned to look at me with a look that was surprisingly tender compared to the ice she had just shown Jasmine. She asked me quite simply if Jasmine was actually my fiancée. I didn't hesitate for a second before telling her that Jasmine was absolutely not my fiancée. Ava let out a soft, confident laugh that made the tension in the room feel very different. The way she looked at me made the rest of the world disappear, and all I could see were her incredibly bright, focused eyes. I felt like I couldn't even think straight for a moment. I found myself staring at her and wondering if she was intentionally trying to charm me. I had this sudden, ridiculous urge to lean in and kiss her right there in the middle of the police station. Jasmine looked like she was about to have an aneurysm watching us. She was practically vibrating with jealousy and hatred as she watched the interaction between Ava and me. Before she could start another scene, the officer called me back for my final statement. By the time we finally walked out of the precinct, the sun had already set. Ava and I walked out together toward her car. We were almost there when Jasmine's voice cut through the air informing me that my parents had been notified about the crash. She told me they were worried and waiting for me at my place, suggesting I should go and see them. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing at the idea of them actually being worried. It was funny that she used the word worried when neither of them had bothered to call or text to see if I was even alive. Their idea of concern was apparently just sitting at home waiting for me to show up and tell them everything was fine. They both had their own separate lives and new partners, and the only reason they even acknowledged me was because of the ironclad inheritance clause in their divorce papers. If it wasn't for that legal requirement, I probably wouldn't have seen a dime of the sterling money. I grew up celebrating my own achievements, like buying myself a cupcake whenever I finished at the top of my class. I had finally made peace with my solitude when Jasmine entered the picture. Our families had been close for generations, and there had always been talk of a marriage merger. Things only became official after my parents finally signed their divorce papers and went their separate ways. My father married Noah's mother almost immediately, only to claim he had found a new true love just a few years later. Despite being an illegitimate child, Jasmine was brought into the Harrison household and raised with all the family's privileges. The original plan was for me to marry Ava Harrison to solidify the family alliance. But once I started college, Jasmine made it her mission to win me over, constantly pursuing me with calculated displays of affection. I was young and inexperienced, so it didn't take much for her to sweep me off my feet. She was relentless, staging romantic surprises every day until I was convinced she was actually in love with me. I ignored everyone's warnings and agreed to the engagement. Even my parents seemed to prefer her to me, probably because she was much better at playing their social games. They saw her as a strategic asset, someone who could manage the family business while I just acted as a figurehead. They actually had the nerve to call this cold-blooded arrangement an act of parental love. I knew that once our families were legally tied together, a divorce would be a financial nightmare. I stayed in that miserable marriage for 6 years, just trying to find a way out that wouldn't ruin me. It took 6 years, but I finally gathered enough evidence of her embezzlement to force her hand. I shook off those memories and climbed into the passenger seat of Ava's car. I looked over at Ava and asked if I could drive her home. She didn't say no, so I pulled out of the parking lot and headed toward her place. She told me she would pick me up tomorrow morning so we could go to her family estate and deal with the engagement once and for all. I quickly put my number into her phone and handed it back to her. The atmosphere in the house was suffocating the moment I walked in. My father stood up immediately and started screaming at me before I could even get my coat off. He demanded to know how I could be so irresponsible and complained about the expensive business dinner he had to cancel just to deal with my mess. He didn't even ask if I was hurt from the crash. He started defending Noah, telling me I was being a terrible brother for threatening him at the station. My mother finally snapped, grabbed a vase off the table, and hurled it at his head. She accused my father, Diego, of trying to force me into a marriage with Jasmine just so he could eventually hand the combined family fortune over to Noah. She screamed that she knew all about Noah and Jasmine's secret affair and that she wasn't going to let them win. I stood up and told them both very calmly that the alliance with the Harrison family was staying, but I would be marrying Ava instead of Jasmine. My mother was already waiting in the driveway when I woke up the next morning. By the time we got to the Harrison estate, Noah was already there, looking smug. Ava walked down the grand staircase and took my hand in hers. She looked directly at Jasmine and told her that the family engagement wasn't being canceled. It was just being reassigned to her. Jasmine's face twisted in rage as she saw us holding hands, and she shrieked, demanding to know how this was possible. I just gave her a small, cold smile and asked her if she really wanted me to list all the reasons in front of everyone. The Harrison matriarch apologized for the drama and told me that if I married Ava, she would transfer all her voting shares to us. I thanked her with a polite bow, knowing that this was the end of Jasmine's ambitions. We were walking to the car when Jasmine came running after us. She was crying and begging me to listen to her explanation for why she had treated me so poorly in the past. I rolled down the window and told her that if she was so full of regret, she should go spend her time with Noah and leave me alone. It took 2 months of intense negotiations, but I finally secured the Chicago contract for the Sterling family. Ava and I celebrated that victory together, staying up until the sun came up the next morning. I walked into the office the next morning to find Jasmine waiting for me with a huge bouquet of flowers. She was sobbing and pleading for my forgiveness, saying she had made a terrible mistake. Well, I tried to ignore her. She ran to the window and threatened to jump if I didn't take her back. She was leaning so far out that people on the street started to look up. Ava walked into the room and pulled me away from the window, standing between me and Jasmine. She told Jasmine to go ahead and jump, but warned her that her mother would be out on the street by tomorrow morning if she did. I heard from a friend later that my father had moved on to a new girlfriend and forgotten all about Noah. Finding himself abandoned, Noah stole every cent he could from Jasmine's accounts and fled the country with his mother. Jasmine eventually tracked him down and shot him in the middle of a busy street, which led to her immediate arrest. I didn't feel anything when I heard the news, as they were no longer a part of my life. These days, I just enjoy my life at home with Ava. I like to tease her while she gets ready, asking her to wear that dress I like one more time before we go out. I have learned that a lifeline offered by someone else can easily become a chain, and true survival only comes when you take the controls yourself. A parachute might save your body, but only self-respect and clarity can truly save your soul.